The storm raged fiercely, its howling winds whipping the sea into a frenzy. Waves crashed against the hull of the small ship, threatening to swallow it whole. Henry Tudor, barely 14 years old, clung to the mast, his knuckles white and his face pale. Beside him, his uncle Jasper Tudor shouted orders to the crew, his voice barely audible over the roar of the tempest. "Hold steady," Jasper bellowed, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We cannot afford to lose our way now." Henry's stomach churned, not just from the violent rocking of the ship, but from the weight of their flight. They were fugitives, hunted by the Yorkist king, Edward IV, who had crushed the Lancastrian cause at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Henry's father, Edmund Tudor, was long dead, and his mother, Margaret Beaufort, had been forced to submit to the Yorkist regime. Henry was the last hope of the House of Lancaster, and his survival was a miracle in itself. As the ship battled the storm, Henry's mind drifted to the chaos they had left behind. The Wars of the Roses had torn England apart, pitting cousin against cousin, brother against brother. The Lancastrians had been defeated, their leaders slaughtered or exiled. Henry had been too young to fight, but his bloodline made him a target. The Yorkists would not rest until every threat to their throne was eliminated. The storm began to subside as dawn broke, revealing the rugged coastline of Brittany. Henry's heart lifted at the sight. They had made it, for now they were safe. Duke Francis II of Brittany welcomed the Tudors with cautious hospitality. The Duke was a shrewd ruler, well aware of the value of his new guests. Henry and Jasper were given quarters in the imposing Chateau de l'Hermine, where they were treated with respect but kept under close watch. "You are welcome here," Duke Francis said, his tone measured, "but you must understand that your presence complicates matters. Edward of England will not be pleased to know I harbour his enemies." Jasper bowed his head. "We are grateful for your protection, your grace. We ask only for refuge until the time is right to reclaim what is ours." Henry remained silent, his young face betraying none of the turmoil within. He knew they were pawns in a larger game, their fate tied to the shifting alliances of Europe. But he also knew that survival was the first step toward victory. Over the next few years, Henry grew into a young man under Jasper's guidance. He studied politics, warfare, and diplomacy, learning the skills he would need to navigate the treacherous world of court intrigue. But despite the relative safety of Brittany, the threat of the Yorkists loomed large. In England, Edward IV's reign brought a fragile peace. The Yorkist king was a charismatic and capable ruler, but his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, watched with a calculating gaze. Richard was ambitious, and he saw Henry Tudor as a lingering threat to the Yorkist dynasty. "The boy is a danger," Richard said to Edward during a council meeting. "As long as he lives, the Lancastrians will rally around him. We must eliminate him." Edward sighed, his expression weary. "Henry Tudor is a child, Richard. He poses no immediate threat. Let him rot in exile." But Richard was not satisfied. He dispatched spies to Brittany, tasked with capturing Henry and bringing him to England. The Yorkist agents arrived at Duke Francis's court, their presence sending a ripple of tension through the castle. "Your Grace," the lead envoy said, bowing before Duke Francis, "King Edward demands the surrender of Henry Tudor. He is a traitor to the crown and must face justice." Duke Francis hesitated, his mind racing. Handing Henry over would please Edward and secure his alliance, but it would also remove a valuable bargaining chip. Keeping Henry risked angering the Yorkists, but it could prove useful in the future. "I will consider your request," Duke Francis said finally, "but for now, Henry Tudor remains under my protection." The envoy's eyes narrowed, but he bowed again and withdrew. Henry, who had been eavesdropping on the conversation, felt a chill run down his spine. He knew his life hung by a thread. If Duke Francis decided to hand him over, there would be no escape. That night, Henry sought out Jasper in their chambers. "Uncle, we cannot stay here," he said, his voice low but urgent. "The Yorkists will not stop until they have me. We must leave Brittany." Jasper frowned, his expression grave. "Where would we go, Henry? We have no allies, no army. Our only hope is to bide our time and wait for the right moment. And if that moment never comes," Henry countered, "we cannot rely on Duke Francis's goodwill forever. We must take our fate into our own hands." Jasper studied his nephew, seeing the determination in his eyes. Henry was no longer a boy. He was a young man with a fire in his heart and a hunger for justice. "Very well," Jasper said finally. "We will make plans to leave, but we must be careful. One misstep and we are lost." As the days passed, Henry and Jasper began to quietly prepare for their escape. They gathered supplies, forged alliances with sympathetic nobles, and kept a close eye on Duke Francis's movements. But the Yorkist spies were watching too, and the net around them was tightening. One evening, as Henry walked the castle grounds, he noticed a shadow following him. He quickened his pace, his heart pounding. The shadow drew closer, and Henry realized he was out of time. He broke into a run, darting through the narrow streets of the town outside the castle. The spy gave chase, voice, his footsteps echoing in the night. Henry's mind raced as he searched for a way to escape. Rounding a corner, he spotted a group of merchants loading goods onto a cart. Without hesitation, he slipped into the back of the cart and hid beneath a pile of sacks. The spy ran past, cursing under his breath. Henry stayed hidden until the cart began to move, carrying him away from the town and toward the coast. He knew this was his chance. He would not wait for the Yorkists to come for him. He would take control of his destiny. As the cart rumbled into the night, Henry clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. The battle for survival was far from over, and he was ready to fight. The cart rattled along the rough coastal road, its wooden wheels creaking under the weight of the goods it carried. Henry Tudor lay hidden beneath a pile of sacks, his heart pounding as he listened for any sign of pursuit. The night was dark, the moon obscured by thick clouds, and the only sounds were the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves and the distant crash of waves against the shore. Henry's mind raced. He had escaped the immediate danger, but he knew the Yorkist spies would not give up so easily. He needed to find Jasper and get as far from Brittany as possible. But where could they go? They had no allies, no army, and no safe haven. The cart came to a sudden halt, jolting Henry from his thoughts. He heard the driver exchange words with someone, then the cart began to move again, this time turning onto a narrower path. Henry risked peeking out from beneath the sacks and saw that they were approaching a small fishing village. The smell of salt and seaweed filled the air, and the faint glow of lanterns illuminated the outlines of cottages and boats. When the cart finally stopped, Henry waited until the driver had moved away before slipping out and crouching in the shadows. He scanned the area, looking for any sign of Jasper or a place to hide. His eyes fell on a small inn at the edge of the village, its windows glowing warmly. Taking a deep breath, Henry crept toward the inn, keeping to the shadows. He slipped inside through the back door and found himself in a cramped kitchen. The innkeeper, a stout woman with a kind face, was stirring a pot over the fire. She looked up in surprise as Henry stepped into the light. "Who are you, boy?" she asked, her voice sharp but not unkind. I need help," Henry stammered. "My uncle and I are in danger. We must leave Brittany." The innkeeper studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Wait here," she said, disappearing into the main room of the inn. She returned moments later with Jasper, who looked both relieved and exasperated to see Henry. "You foolish boy," Jasper said, pulling Henry into a tight embrace. "You could have been killed." "I had no choice," Henry replied. "The Yorkists are closing in. We cannot stay here." Jasper sighed, his expression grim. "You're right, but we cannot leave without a plan. We need allies, ships and men, and we need them quickly." Over the next few days, Henry and Jasper worked in secret to gather support. The innkeeper, whose name was Marie, proved to be a valuable ally. She had connections with the local fishermen and merchants, many of whom were sympathetic to the Lancastrian cause. "There is a man," Marie told them one evening, "a captain named Guillaume. He has a ship and a crew loyal to Duke Francis, but he has no love for the Yorkists. If you can convince him to help you, he may be your best chance." Henry and Jasper met with Captain Guillaume the following night. The captain was a grizzled man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened carefully as Jasper explained their situation. "You ask much," Guillaume said when Jasper had finished. "To defy Duke Francis and risk the wrath of the Yorkists is no small thing. What do you offer in return?" Henry stepped forward, his voice steady. "If you help us, you will have the gratitude of the future king of England, and when the time comes, you will be rewarded beyond measure." Guillaume studied Henry for a long moment, then nodded. "Very well, I will take you to France, but know this, if we are caught, I will not hesitate to abandon you to save my crew." Henry and Jasper agreed, knowing it was the best offer they would get. The journey to France was fraught with danger. The Yorkist spies were still searching for Henry, and the seas were patrolled by English ships. But Guillaume was a skilled captain, and he navigated the treacherous waters with ease. When they finally reached the French coast, Henry felt a surge of hope. France was a powerful kingdom, and its ruler, King Louis XI, was no friend to Edward IV. If they could secure his support, they might have a chance to reclaim the English throne. But gaining an audience with King Louis was no easy task. The French court was a labyrinth of intrigue, and Henry and Jasper were outsiders with little to offer. They spent weeks in the shadows, pleading their case to anyone who would listen. Finally, through a combination of persistence and luck, they managed to secure a meeting with the king. Louis XI, known as the Spider King for his cunning and manipulation, received them in his private chambers. "So," Louis said, his voice dripping with skepticism, "you are the last hope of the House of Lancaster. Tell me, why should I risk risk my kingdom to help you." Henry stepped forward, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "Your Majesty, the Yorkists are a threat to us both. Edward IV seeks to expand his influence, and if he succeeds, he will turn his eyes to France. But if you help me reclaim my throne, I will ensure that England remains a loyal ally to your kingdom." Louis studied Henry for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "You have spirit, young Tudor. Very well, I will give you the support you need, but remember, you owe me a great head." With Louis's backing, Henry and Jasper began to gather an army. French soldiers, mercenaries, and exiled Lancastrians flocked to their cause, but as their forces grew, so did the tension. The Yorkists were not idle, and they would not let Henry challenge their rule without a fight. One evening, as Henry reviewed maps of England with Jasper and his advisors, a messenger burst into the room. "My lords," the messenger said, breathless, "Edward IV is dead. His brother Richard has seized the throne." Henry's heart skipped a beat. Richard III was a ruthless and ambitious man, and his reign would be even more dangerous than Edward's, but it also presented an opportunity. "This changes everything," Jasper said, his eyes gleaming. "The people of England will not accept Richard as their king. If we strike now, we may have a chance." Henry nodded, his resolve hardening. The time for waiting was over. The battle for survival had become a battle for the throne. The news of Edward IV's death and Richard III's usurpation of the English throne sent shockwaves through Europe. In France, Henry Tudor and his uncle Jasper saw an opportunity they could not ignore. The people of England were restless, and Richard's ruthless rise to power had sown seeds of discontent. Henry stood in the dimly lit chamber of a French castle, surrounded by his advisors and a growing band of loyal supporters. Maps of England were spread across a large table, marked with strategic points and potential allies. The room buzzed with tension and anticipation. "Richard has overreached," Jasper said, his voice firm. "He has alienated many of the nobles, and the people will not forget how he seized the throne. If we act now, we can rally them to our cause." Henry nodded, his eyes fixed on the map. "But we must be careful. Richard is a skilled warrior and a cunning strategist. We cannot afford to underestimate him." One of Henry's advisors, a grizzled mercenary captain named Pierre, leaned forward. "We have the support of King Louis, but his help comes with strings attached. We need more than French gold and soldiers. We need English allies." Henry's mind raced. He knew that to succeed, he would need to unite the fractured factions of England under his banner. And there was one family whose support could tip the scales in his favor: the Woodvilles. The Woodvilles, relatives of Edward IV's widow, Elizabeth Woodville, had been powerful allies of the Yorkists, but Richard's rise had left them vulnerable and bitter. Henry knew that if he could secure their support, he would gain not only their resources, but also their connections to the English nobility. Henry sent a secret message to Elizabeth Woodville, who was living in sanctuary with her daughters. In it, he proposed an alliance sealed by marriage. If Henry could defeat Richard and claim the throne, he would marry Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York. The response came quickly. Elizabeth agreed to the plan, and her supporters began quietly rallying to Henry's cause. With his alliance secured, Henry prepared to invade England. King Louis provided ships, soldiers, and funds, but the journey across the Channel was fraught with peril. Richard's spies were everywhere, and the English navy patrolled the waters. On a cold August morning in 1485, Henry's fleet set sail from Harfleur. The crossing was tense, with storms threatening to scatter the ships and delay their arrival. But Henry's determination never wavered. He stood on the deck of his flagship, the Trinity, staring at the horizon as England came into view. "This is it," Jasper said, joining him. "The moment we've been waiting for." Henry nodded, his heart pounding. "For my father, for my mother, for all those who have suffered under Yorkist rule, we will not fail." Henry's forces landed at Milford Haven in Wales, a strategic location that allowed him to gather support from his Welsh allies. The Welsh had long been sympathetic to the Lancastrian cause, and many flocked to Henry's banner as he marched inland. But Richard was not idle. He had been preparing for this moment, and he moved quickly to intercept Henry's army. The two forces met at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire on August 22nd, 1485. The morning of the battle dawned grey and misty, the air thick with tension. Henry's army was outnumbered, but his troops were determined. He rode among them, inspiring them with words of courage and hope. "Today, we fight not just for ourselves, but for the future of England," Henry declared. "We fight to end the tyranny of Richard III and to bring peace to our land. Stand with me, and together we will prevail." The battle began with a thunderous clash of steel and the cries of men. Henry's forces held their ground, but Richard's army was relentless. The tide of the battle shifted back and forth, and for a moment it seemed that all was was lost. Then, something unexpected happened. Lord Stanley, a powerful noble who had been watching the battle from the sidelines, made his move. Despite being married to Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, Stanley had remained neutral until now. At the critical moment, Stanley's forces charged into the fray, attacking Richard's army from the flank. The Yorkist lines broke and chaos erupted. Henry seized the opportunity. He led a charge straight toward Richard, who was fighting fiercely in the thick of the battle. The two men locked eyes, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Richard, realizing that his cause was lost, rallied his remaining loyalists and made a desperate push toward Henry, but it was too late. A blow from a halberd struck Richard down, and the last Yorkist king fell in the mud of Bosworth Field. The battle was over. Henry's forces had won. As the sun broke through the clouds, Henry stood amidst the carnage, his sword bloodied and his heart heavy. He had achieved what once seemed impossible, but the cost had been high. Jasper approached, his face weary but triumphant. "You've done it, Henry. The throne is yours." Henry nodded, but his thoughts were already turning to the future. He knew that claiming the crown was only the beginning. The real challenge would be uniting a fractured kingdom and building a lasting peace. On October 30th, 1485, Henry Tudor was crowned King Henry VII of England in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was a solemn affair, marking the end of the Wars of the Roses and the beginning of a new era. As Henry placed the crown on his head, he thought of all those who had fought and died to bring him to this moment. He vowed to honor their sacrifice by ruling wisely and justly. In the months that followed, Henry fulfilled his promise to marry Elizabeth of York, uniting the houses of Lancaster and York and symbolically ending the decades-long conflict. The Tudor dynasty was born, and with it, a new chapter in English history. But Henry never forgot the lessons of his exile and his battle for survival. He ruled with caution and determination, always mindful of the fragility of power and the cost of ambition.